everyone. I'm Jazmin Mora. For those who still don't know me, I'm at the Center for Sustainable Development. I have the pleasure of introducing our next guest for the special session. Dr. Peter Sutoris is an environmental anthropologist and assistant professor in the Department of Education at the University of York. He's the author of books, Visions of Development and Educating for the Anthropocene. He tweets at P. Sutoris, and more about his research can be found on his website, which is www.petersutoris.com, which I will be putting on the chat. So welcome, Dr. Sutoris, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jazmin. I'm just going to share my screen because I have a few slides that I would like to go through. So let me just try that and see if that works. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Great, excellent. Okay, yeah, so thanks everyone. I think I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then I think we'll have some time for questions. So this is a session about this new book, which has recently come out, called Educating for the Anthropocene, published by the MIT Press. And I should say that the book is obviously available for purchase, but it's also an open access book. So it can be read for free online. And I'll make sure to drop the link to the free open access version into the chat for anybody who would like to take a look at it later, or also share it in your networks. Please feel free to do so. These initial quotes just give you a little bit of a taste for the framing of the book and some of the ideas that the book is drawing on. This is what it looks like. Let me just start by saying a little bit about the title and the word Anthropocene, which I would imagine probably a good number of people on this call has seen before, but I use it in a fairly particular way. So I want to just say very briefly what I mean by it. The word comes originally from geology, and it refers to a new geological era, which some scientists, believe we are now living through, which is characterized by human influence on the planet. And if you look at the ways that some of the previous eras started in geological history, one of the most famous ones is the Paleocene, 66 million years ago, when a large asteroid fell on Earth and caused the extinction of dinosaurs, among other things. Basically, the idea of the Anthropocene is that humanity is now the asteroid, right? That we have this level of influence over the planet. So it's a sort of a metaphor for our collective influence over the Earth and the ways that we are altering our natural environment. Which of course is not an unproblematic idea. Humanity as a kind of homogeneous category, is not something that necessarily works particularly well in this context, because we know that some groups of people are much more responsible than others for environmental decay, and also other, some groups are more affected than others. But the way I use it, I use this concept in the book, is more to do with the future. It's sort of forward-looking, thinking about what is the role of education in this new era, sort of looking towards the future, which is not to say that figuring out who is responsible is not important. So in that sense, the book tries to articulate a alternative way of thinking about education that responds to the historical moment that we are living in, to say something like 21st century education. So I put the idea of 21st century education very much in contrast to this idea of educating for the Anthropocene. And hopefully by the time I'm done talking, it'll be clear what the differences might be. So let me just tell you a little bit about this book. It's an ethnography, which means that it's a book that tells stories of people in communities, two communities in particular. The first community is in northern India, in Uttarakhand. What you're looking at here is the Tehri Dam, which displaced about 100,000 people. And one of the communities that I worked with in the course of the research that led to this book is one of the rehabilitation sites to which people were forcibly moved after this dam or before this dam was built. They were sort of dumped quite literally in the middle of a sort of undeveloped space. This is, what you're looking at here, what it looks like now. It's very different from what it looked like 20 years ago when people first moved here. It's a place called Pashulok, sort of in the vicinity of the dam. And it is a really sort of impoverished place. This is a shopping center that is sort of abandoned and where the local school is squatting on the second floor. And that's where I did my research for the Indian side of this book, which is in some ways similar, but also different from the South African side. So the other community is in South Africa, in South Durban, which is a place where, by some estimates, about 10% of South Africa's GDP originates. And it's a place of tremendous industrial pollution. You're looking at a view of an oil refinery from the corridor of a school. So literally just a stone's throw away from the refinery, the residential areas, being built up all the way to the fence line of this refinery, which hasn't been upgraded since the 60s, really. The rates of asthma, of thyroid cancer, of other air pollution-induced public health issues are really sort of skyrocketing in this area, and it's considered really one of the most sort of industrially polluted places on Earth. So you could ask, why go to places like these two communities to ask questions about what education's role is in the Anthropocene? And really, the answer is that in some ways, I think of these places as almost a bit of a time machine. Spaces that give us a preview of the level of environmental degradation that perhaps not all of us are experiencing, but that sooner or later many areas around the world might, in one form or another, experience. And in that sense, I was curious to find out how the local populations, how these communities respond to these threats, these environmental threats that they're facing. You might have noticed in the subtitle of the book, I refer to the concept slow violence, which is another book by Rob Nixon, which came out about 10 years ago now, that I would also highly recommend. The idea that a lot of environmental decay, environmental destruction happens quite slowly, almost imperceptibly, which makes it particularly challenging for educators to address. How do you educate somebody about something which is difficult to perceive in real time? So part of the argument of this book is that places like these communities are actually spaces where slow violence accelerates. It turns into fast violence. It becomes much more visceral, more visible. It is something that people have to really contend with in their daily lives. So this is no longer an abstract threat that might affect us in the future. It's a very concrete, immediate threat that is posed by environmental decay. And so I was interested in how young people make sense of life in these kinds of spaces, and how education might help them make sense of this condition. I relied quite heavily on visual methods borrowed from visual anthropology in trying to understand this. So I worked with young people on various visualization exercises. This is a drawing that one of the children that I worked with in South Africa made in response to a prompt about imagining the future 100 years from now. So you can see the kind of dystopian image here. Another one also from South Africa. There was also a prompt I worked with which had to do with the past. So thinking about what the past might have looked like and how it might be different from the future. So you can see a clear contrast between the way that the children depicted the future and the past. But I thought this is interesting, but there's got to be more to this, right? And the beauty of ethnography is that you get to spend a lot of time in a place, and you get to really sort of talk to people and get to know people and build relationships of trust. I mean, based on these drawings, I could basically just conclude that the young people are despairing about the future and idolizing the past, which is what a lot of us in academia do in one way or another. But I was really curious, to go a little bit deeper. So I worked with these young people on making short films, again, visual methods, sort of visualizations of their lives, where I sort of did this workshop where I told them how to use camera equipment, and then they would take these cameras home and they would make these short sort of observational films about their lives and their experiences of life in these communities. And these films would then become starting points for a conversation that we had about their imaginations of the future. And what was very interesting to me was that the children in both cases, in both countries, made the choice to focus almost exclusively on older people, on activists in their communities. So these spaces of what I call accelerating slow violence are actually spaces where people are not only threatened by environmental decay, but they're also resisting and responding to that decay in all kinds of interesting and creative ways. So in both cases, there is a strong presence of environmental activism. In the case of India, activism against large dams, but also that sort of very much critiques the kind of overarching narrative, grand sort of development narrative of a certain kind of modernity and certain kind of development. And in the case of South Africa, a movement which is very much looking at air pollution, but also the kind of environmental racism behind the city planning and the construction of the neighborhoods that are adjacent to these petrochemical industries in South Durban. And the children almost instinctively sort of gravitated towards these activist figures in these films, where they wanted to talk to them, in the case of India, about what life was like before the dam, what was lost due to the dam, what were the kinds of indigenous lifestyles that might have existed in this area. And in the case of South Africa, about the rights that people in this community have, environmental protection rights that are actually anchored in the South African Constitution. And so this really led me in this project to look at activism as a space of learning, as a space of education, as a kind of alternative space in which young people might be able to educate themselves or be educated in and for the Anthropocene. And so I make this argument in the book about activism as a form of education, which is an argument that first and foremost requires that we distinguish between spaces of education and spaces of schooling. So education is not the same as schooling. There are alternative spaces, and there are also academics who work on projects that are parallel to this project, where they might look at, for example, religion or spirituality. So in my case, I looked at activism, but there are other informal and non-formal spaces that we can be looking at for inspiration about how to respond to this Anthropocene moment. I think this is also an approach, this recognition of activism as education, that really calls for localization of curricula and giving teachers agency in the process. If we want to think of sort of schooling practices that are inspired by activism, then we really need to think of teachers as having a lot of agency, not just delivering a curriculum, not just being deliverers of something that somebody else has designed, not just passing down a blueprint, but really sort of co-constructing that practice of whether we call it activism or something else with the learners. I think there's also something to be said for removing barriers between activists and educators, and that was one of the things that came out of this research, that in both of these places there was very little dialogue between the schools and these activist groups. And you sort of tended to see a lot of suspicion, actually, where the activists might have said, well, these teachers are part of the problem. They're agents of the state. They're spreading a particular narrative, which is dangerous and which is discriminatory against the people who live in this area. Whereas the educators might have said of the activists, that these activists are sort of anti-system radical elements. They should never be allowed in schools. and we should be careful with them. So I think there was a lot of suspicion, and my sense is that this is not unique to these two cases, these two sites, and perhaps there's something that we can ponder here around how we might build bridges between these groups. But as part of this book, what I try to do is I also try to articulate a kind of a model for education, or a set of ideas that I derived from my interactions, both with the activists and with the teachers, with the educators in these places, around what this idea of educating for the Anthropocene might look like. And I try to contrast it with the kind of much better known concept of education for the 21st century that many of us will be familiar with, and concepts like critical thinking, teamwork, metacognition, right? I mean, these are buzzwords that get thrown around a lot. And I think arguably in many cases, these concepts don't necessarily signify what they once used to signify. Critical thinking isn't necessarily so much about, truly thinking critically. In the book, I sort of say that it's in many cases become more about problem solving for infinite growth, right? Is this idea that we are producing graduates through education systems whose job it is to join the workforce and to contribute to this idea of infinite economic growth on a finite planet, which is something that we don't really challenge. So we think critically, but not too critically, right? That there's a sort of a limit. There's a point after which something like critical thinking is no longer desirable. And so the idea of educating for the Anthropocene in some ways is to not necessarily try to suggest something that is the complete opposite of 21st century education, but in some ways is more of a return and revisiting some of the ideas that might have led us to think about, what educating for the 21st century might look like, but using this idea of the Anthropocene, which forces us to engage with deep time. It forces us to engage with scales of time that are beyond the individual lifespan of individual people or even individual societies. It forces us to think from the perspective of the planet. So you could say it's a way of building empathy with the planet and with the non-human. It forces us to think about planetary boundaries and stewardship. And I think it also forces us to really think carefully about what we mean by sustainability. Half of the book is about activism, but the other half is about the formal schooling and the formal education that the children in these places are receiving. And there is nothing that these children are learning in their schools through their school curricula about the kinds of environmental racism or the kind of social injustice that occurred in these places, and the environmental decay and the way that it threatens human habitation in these spaces. So the idea of sustainability in these curricula is very, very abstract, and it doesn't seem to confront the notion that somehow these different dimensions of sustainability, the economic, the social, the environmental, might actually sometimes be in conflict with one another, and that the environmental aspect sometimes actually gets suppressed. So to conclude, I, as part of this project, spent a bit of time with designers and thought with designers and through design thinking about how some of these ideas might be distilled into something that could be shared with non-academics, with people sort of outside of academia who don't necessarily want to read a whole academic monograph. And we came up with this model of these 4 words, or rather, I'll just skip to the final slide, 5 words: grasp, care, imagine, communicate, and act. Grasping what is at stake, care as an emotional response to that which is at stake, which again, is sounds like common sense, but is quite different from the sort of direction of travel in education, which in many places is much more towards the cognitive, the rational, rather than the emotional. Imagination of alternative futures, the ability to communicate that imagination of that alternative future to others. And through that friction of communication of the differences between these different imagined futures, then being able to act pluralistically, act together. And this is a circle, so it's iterative. Once I have communicated with others, I might realize there's something I didn't grasp, which might lead to a different emotional response, a different imagination. So this is kind of iterative cyclical learning not something that is set in stone, but something that is dynamic. And perhaps the final thing to say here is that these are not necessarily new ideas, and I'm not really claiming that I'm sort of describing something revolutionarily different from ideas that have existed really for thousands of years, right? I mean, the kind of ancient wisdom of know thyself, has been around for a very long time. And these words in many ways are nothing more than that, right? They're about discovering or rediscovering, reconnecting with these ways of being human that really are inherent to us, right? I mean, grasping when we are born, one of the first things we do is we start grasping the things around us. Care, imagination, communication, action. These are things that come naturally to us as human beings. So in some ways, this call for educating for the Anthropocene is nothing more than just recontextualizing these ideas, putting them in conversation with the historical moment and the challenges of the historical moment, and really sort of taking stock of whether what we are currently doing in education is moving in this direction or away from this model. So I think I've spoken enough, so I think I'll stop there. But yeah, I will momentarily post the link to the open access version of the book. So do feel free to take a look at it if you'd like to learn more.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sutoris. That was an amazing summary of the work you've been doing. You mentioned you talk a lot about the disconnection between activism and schooling, and how the formal education and the informal education kind of like are not really talking to each other right now, which I think is a recurrent theme that we've seen in other sessions as well. Do you have any suggestion in your experience with this project on how to bridge that gap between the two, or creating more like a learning community experience?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess one part of the answer would be to say that actually in some ways the divide maybe isn't, I'm going to sort of contradict myself slightly here. The divide is not as big as it might seem. So, to me, the divide seemed a lot bigger when I first started working on this. So, as an ethnography, it took years to do this work. So, I was in the field on and off for 5 years. And certainly when I think about the beginning of the process and the end of it, initially I thought, these are two completely disconnected groups of people who don't talk to one another. But by the end, I was a lot more hopeful in some ways. In fact, the book has a section called Outlier Teachers, where I talk about teachers who are sort of full-time employed educators within state-run government-controlled education systems, but who are sort of secretly activists. So they sympathize with the activist agendas, and they try to sort of push the boundaries of what is acceptable and what they can do within that system. So I think part of the answer lies in recognition that some of this is already happening organically, and that perhaps we would do well to properly document that, to understand that phenomenon of teachers exercising their agency in unexpected ways, and being creative and thinking outside of the box, and learning from that practice and trying to see if that can be somehow replicated or if we can find inspiration in that. But beyond that, I think there are certainly policy lessons to be learned here around thinking of a space like activism, but also these other spaces, such as religion, spirituality, etc., etc. Thinking of them as spaces of learning, and really giving them the visibility within our policy frameworks, giving them the recognition, giving them funding, right? I think this might sound controversial because in many countries in the world, there isn't enough funding to fund the existing formal systems. But I do think that when it comes to something like the Anthropocene and just the level of environmental destruction, environmental decay, making sense of that, preparing somebody for that. We just need to recognize that this needs to be a wider coalition that responds to this than simply just schools. So I do think there are some policy conversations to be had around that visibility, that recognition, and that support, including financial support.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive answer. We have a question from Mercy Bed. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. So I've listened to Peter. Your case studies are quite interesting. I come from Kenya, Africa as well. So those issues are quite familiar, right? And listening to your difference between, the disconnect between the activism and the education, it made me think about the situation going on here. And I feel like the issue around most developing countries is the fact that we are unable to we're supposed to start with the culture change first, go into the deep issues, the reason why these people are taking their children to school, or the reason why education is not being clearly fostered in these areas. So, because most, for example, let me give you an example, like where I come from, there's a lot of FGM, yeah, and parents actually drink, yeah, parents actually drink a lot, and they forget to take their children to school, right? And this is, of course, due to poverty. And you'll find that there's a lot of suppression, there's women empowerment. So I feel like it starts with the man first has to be empowered, right? There has to be culture change. They have to know that the reason why these children need to go to school, the reason why FGM needs to be stopped. So it's just, I feel like it's a step-by-step procedure where you first start from the culture change, and then you now go into activism, because the activists are just pushing an agenda, correct? They are trying to sell a narrative, but they do not understand where these people are coming from. So I feel like by starting with culture change, you'll be able to tackle the end product, like technically why they're not going to school, and also be able to lead them to the end goal at the end of the day. I don't know if I've made sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're definitely getting at something very, very important there. I mean, it's a sort of a chicken and egg question, right? I mean, what comes first, educational culture change? Because education also can create culture change. And maybe that also goes back to, again, what we sort of mean by education. Because for education to create culture change, it has to, a certain amount of time has to pass. These children that we are educating, has to sort of become adults, and and then that's kind of how that change could happen. But it could take decades. But if we think of education as something that is not simply just something that we do to young people, but a broader set of processes in society that have to do with learning, that have to do with intergenerational dialogue, intergenerational knowledge, then I think we get a very different picture of the relationship between culture change and education. And certainly activism is a space that draws not just young people, it draws people of different ages. So we can also think of activism as a space of sort of adult education or lifelong learning. I think we tend to sort of look down upon lifelong learning or adult education, as something that is not as important as schooling. But in many ways, with these environmental issues, where action is really needed very, very soon, really yesterday was too late. We do need to find ways to sort of reach adults, right, and to not just kind of dump all the responsibility on the shoulders of young people. So I think in that sense, again, maybe challenging the definition of education a little bit and thinking about it a bit more holistically, a bit more broadly might be a good idea.
If I may ask, please.
We have 1 more minute, so if you can make it quick, that'd be great. Thank you.
Please, are environmental education programs integrated in the curricula of the American schools? I mean by that, not the universities, but the colleges and under.
It varies. I mean, again, I'm not an expert in American education, but from what I understand, I'm based in the UK. From what I understand, there's a great degree of autonomy, on the state level in the US, and I think these themes, they tend to be sort of seen as kind of cross-cutting themes, right? So they're not necessarily given a dedicated subject or a dedicated space or a dedicated teacher or teacher training program. I think oftentimes it's sort of assumed, that we can tackle something like sustainability as part of a number of subjects, which it can be really good if that's done well, that kind of interdisciplinary, inter-subject kind of approach. But I think more often than not, it in practice ends up meaning that there is no space for this agenda, right? And that it doesn't have a home, and there's nobody who's kind of looking after it, nobody's responsible or accountable for it. And therefore that integration remains on paper. I mean, that's been sadly my experience, and from what I know of the work that colleagues are doing in the US, it's similar in many places there as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sutoris. I'm sorry, everyone. I know that you want to ask many questions, but we're in a very tight schedule. Thank you so much for coming to this session and for talking about your book. You shared the link. I'm sure that everyone is very excited to read it. And thank you again. I would like to pass the microphone.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, if anybody would like to get in touch with me, feel free. Drop me a line. You can find me easily. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Bye.